War at the dawn of the 17th century was a problem. An ugly, expensive, and unreliable problem. For kings and princes dreaming of power, this chaos was useless. You could not build a modern state with bands of plundering mercenaries, men who might desert if you did not pay them, or turn on you if someone else paid more. The solution was not to find better warriors. It was to remove the warrior entirely, to replace him with something new, a component. An interchangeable part in a vast, lethal machine. This is the first great pivot in our story, the pivot to discipline, the invention of the machine soldier. The architect of this new order was a Swedish king, Gustavus Adolphus. He looked at the messy brawl of the battlefield and saw only inefficiency. His insight was brutal in its simplicity. Uncontrolled fire is wasted fire. 100 men firing when they feel like it is just noise. But 100 men firing as one single, synchronized entity. That is a hammer blow. That is mathematical certainty. The tool that made this possible was the flintlock musket, more reliable than the old matchlock. And when you fixed a socket bayonet to its end, you had a universal weapon. The pikemen, the swordsmen, they were now obsolete. Every man in the line was the same, a loader, a shooter, and a spearman. He was a system, but the real weapon was not the gun. It was the drill. Soldiers, often poor men snatched from the streets or the countryside, were subjected to years of relentless, monotonous training. They were broken down and rebuilt. Their individuality was sanded away. Their goal was not to be brave or clever or strong. Their goal was to be automatic, to perform a complex series of actions, tear cartridge, prime pan, load ball, ram home, under the thunder of cannon, in the face of an oncoming line, while men fell screaming to their left and right. To stand and to fire only upon command. And so the battlefield transformed. It became geometry, a lethal exercise in applied mathematics. This was the pure era of linear tactics. Armies deployed in long, thin, brightly colored lines, often just 2 or 3 men deep, to bring every single musket to bear at once. The battlefield was a stage, and the dance was precise, formal, and horrifying. The command would ring out, sharp over the drumbeat. Make ready. A line of men becomes a single organism, moving through the first motion. Present! A forest of muskets rises to the shoulder, a single, horizontal bar of polished steel and dark wood. Fire! A single, deafening crack, a volcano of white smoke. Then, by platoon, by company, by battalion, the volleys would roll down the line like thunder. A continuous, rolling barrage of sound and lead. The goal was not to aim. It was to annihilate the enemy. Well, the machine was built. The line was drawn. But a king's most perfect instrument is useless if it starves in a field or bleeds itself dry against a stone wall. The professional army was a rapacious, fragile beast. It consumed food and powder at a staggering rate. It could not forage forever without dissolving into the very mob of bandits it was created to replace. And so, the generals of the late 17th and early 18th centuries faced a new, more mundane challenge. Not how to fight the battle, but how to get to it. How to sustain the machine. How to make the will of a king manifest across 100 miles of hostile countryside. This is the second great pivot, the pivot to logistics. The conquest of the space between battles, the subjugation of geography itself. The brilliant, unglamorous work of war now happened far from the smoke and glory. It happened on drawing tables and in ledgers. It was a war of wagons, of flour sacks, of marching timetables. Armies became shackled to their supply lines, long, vulnerable trains of carts winding from fortified storehouses called magazines. General's advance was now measured not by the boldness of his maneuvers, but by the speed he could build these magazines forward. His campaign was a slow, deliberate extension of his kingdom's infrastructure into enemy territory. To move too far, too fast, was to snap the umbilical cord and invite disaster. An army off its line of supply was an army living on borrowed time, a clock winding down toward mutiny and collapse. And this cold calculus of supply dictated the very shape of conflict. Pitched battles, those dramatic, decisive clashes of lines we imagine, were in fact rare. They were the exception, the calculated and often dreaded risk. Far more common was the siege, the slow, certain, grinding science of the siege. Warfare became a seasonal affair of methodical encroachment, a battle not of men but of mud and mathematics. Here, the engineer became the true hero of war. Men like the French Marshal Sébastien Leprestre de Vauban turned siegecraft into a precise, geometric formula. A Attacking a fortress was no longer a matter of heroic assault or patient starvation. It was a methodical, earth-moving exercise, as predictable as a chemical reaction. Sappers, the unsung miners of war, would dig a sequence of zigzag trenches, called parallels, ever closer to the fortress walls. Each parallel was a new platform for artillery, a new step in the staircase of destruction. It was a battle of angles and dirt, inching forward under the relentless cover of enfilading fire. The outcome was often a foregone conclusion, a matter of time, geometry, and the simple weight of applied force. The fortress would fall, the territory would be absorbed, and the state's supply lines would inch forward once more. War in this age became a vast and patient engineering project. The ideal general was not a bold cavalry hero, but a master administrator, a meticulous quartermaster, a brilliant surveyor. He was a manager of colossal, lethal bureaucracy. Victory went not to the most aggressive, but to the most patient, to the one who could best manage the endless, dull equations of food, fodder, and fortification. It was warfare as corporate strategy, where balance sheets of beans and bullets were as important as battalions. It was a system of profound control. It made warfare predictable, a costly but manageable instrument of royal diplomacy. It turned the chaotic art of conquest into a slow, surgical science, but it also made it achingly slow, and it cultivated a stifling cult of caution. The machine, this beautiful, expensive, stay-toned machine, was too valuable to risk on a single throw of the dice. Battles were avoided, opportunities missed, all in the name of preserving the apparatus. And in making the army utterly dependent on its elaborate, creeping supply network, it created a colossal, if hidden, vulnerability. The machine was powerful, but it was also tethered, predictable, and blind to any enemy who refused to stand behind a fortress wall or meet on the chosen field of battle. It was a system of immense force, moving at the speed of an ox cart. It was a leviathan, chained to its own stomach, and it was waiting, unknowingly, to be outrun by an idea and by a new kind of army that could move at the speed of a revolution. The machine was powerful. The machine was logical. It had tamed violence into geometry and reduced conquest to a schedule. But it was also profoundly, dangerously fragile. It was a crystal goblet, elegant, expensive, and utterly brittle, resting on a foundation of absolute social order. All it would take was one sharp, unexpected shock to shatter it into a million useless pieces. And in the last decades of the 18th century, that shock arrived. It was not a new weapon from a factory. It was a virus of thought. A new idea, contagious and fatal to the old order, incubated in salons and pamphlets and born in the hearts of men. This is the third great pivot, the pivot to the people. The moment the clinical, stay-toned machine of war was seized, smashed, and rebuilt by the furious hands of the nation itself. For over a century, European war had been the exclusive, closed business of sovereigns and their professional instruments. It was a duel between crowns, fought over strips of territory, dynastic claims, or commercial advantage by paid components who were themselves a form of state property. The common man was its object, a tax source to fund it, a peasant to feed it, a body to fill its ranks, or its collateral damage. But he was never its author, its spirit, or its cause. This was the old world's fatal, arrogant assumption, that the people were a passive resource to be managed, not a latent force of nature to be unleashed. The first hairline fracture appeared not in Europe's heartland, but in the vast, untamed theaters of empire. In the dense forests of North America, British regulars, the polished, scarlet-clad pinnacle of the European military machine, found themselves hunting ghosts. They faced colonial militiamen and their native allies, for whom the battlefield had no lines, only opportunities. These fighters did not form obedient ranks on open ground. They vanished into the terrain. They fired from behind trees and stone walls. They aimed not at the mass, but at the individual, specifically at the officers, the gleaming gold-braided nervous system of the mechanical army. They fought not for a sovereign's shilling, but for homesteads, for community, for a burgeoning sense of self-rule. It was irregular, it was ungentlemanly, and it proved devastatingly effective against the rigid, predictable clockwork of the line. It was a haunting preview, a whisper from the wilderness of the ideological hurricane to come. Then, the very core of the old order convulsed. In 1789, the French Revolution declared war not on another kingdom, but on history itself. It attacked the principle of hierarchy, the divinity of kings, the very architecture of the past. In this superheated atmosphere, the old, cold logic of limited professional war was incinerated. The state, in its old form, was guillotined, and in its place arose the nation, a mystical collective entity of the people by the people. The army could no longer be a separate tool of the state. It had to become the embodied will of the nation. The crisis point came in 1793. The revolution, radical and regicidal, found itself surrounded by a cordon of horrified, vengeful monarchies. Its professional army, eroded by distrust and purges, was collapsing. The Republic's response was not to hire Swiss mercenaries or tighten drill. It reached deeper. It reached into the very soul of the population. It issued the levée en masse, a decree that tore up the centuries-old contract of warfare. The language was not that of a royal edict. It was a fiery sermon, a totalizing call to holy war. From this moment until that in which our enemies shall have been expelled from the territory of the Republic, all Frenchmen are in permanent requisition for the service of the armies. It delineated a new social order entirely organized for conflict. Young men to fight, married men to forge and transport, women to make and to nurse, children to prepare scrap, old men to preach hatred of kings and unity of the Republic. This was not mere conscription. This was the nation metabolizing itself for combat. War was utterly democratized and sanctified. The resource pool for soldiers exploded exponentially, from the limited, manageable class of the poor and the landless, to the entirety of a passionate, politicized citizenry. An army's potential size was now bounded only by demographics, and its motivation underwent a terrifying transformation. It was no longer the fear of the corporal's cane, or the crude hope for loot. It was a blazing, ideological faith, in la patrie, in liberty, in the rights of man. It was a belief that the soil they defended was theirs, that the cause was sacred, that defeat meant the annihilation of their new world. The professional, interchangeable component of the old machine was annihilated. In his place stood the citizen soldier. He was often a mess, ill-clothed in a ragged blue coat, poorly drilled, his movements lacking robotic precision. But he marched with a conviction the most disciplined mercenary could never comprehend. He could endure catastrophic shortages, miserable conditions, and staggering casualties that would have caused a professional army to mutiny or dissolve, because he believed he was fighting for his own sovereign future. He was not defending a king's border. He was building a nation's frontier. The brittle, beautiful crystal of the old way did not just crack. It was vaporized in the thermal pulse of this new force. The slow, geometric wars of magazines and cautious maneuvers were drowned in a human tidal wave. The horde in the contemptuous view of aristocrats, the nation in arms in its own triumphant vision. The battlefield ceased to be a chessboard for gentlemen and became an altar for a secular religion. The clean equation of war had been violently rewritten. The variable of discipline was now joined and utterly overpowered by the incalculable, volatile exponent of national will. The age of the People's War, of total war in its ideological infancy, had violently begun. And watching from the sidelines, a keen, ambitious young Corsican artillery officer, Napoleon Bonaparte, studied this raw, chaotic, magnificent energy. He saw not just an army, but a new kind of power. And he began calculating how to harness that hurricane, how to channel that national will into a new, even more terrible and efficient machine of his own design. The revolution had created the fuel. He would now build the engine. The hurricane was unleashed. The people had become the army, a tidal wave of blue coats and raw conviction. But a tidal wave is a force of nature, immense, destructive, but ultimately directionless. It could overwhelm a shoreline, but could it conquer a continent? Could passion alone be engineered into a reliable instrument of conquest? The revolution had answered the question of who would fight. Now, a new mind would answer the question of how. How to weaponize a nation's will. How to turn a revolutionary storm into a precise, predictable system of annihilation. This was not a task for an idealist, but for a systems engineer of genius. This is the fourth great pivot, the pivot to the system. The moment the raw energy of the masses was captured, distilled, and fitted into a perfectly calibrated engine of unprecedented speed and annihilating power. This is the age of Napoleon. Napoleon Bonaparte looked upon the citizen soldier and saw past the fervor. He saw a revolutionary resource, a source of limitless potential energy. His genius was not tactical, but architectural, a genius of structure and flow. He took the volatile, national human material of the levée en masse and forged it into a new modular structure, the Army Corps system. This was the masterstroke that would redefine operational warfare for a century. He abolished the old, monolithic army, that single, ponderous organism that crawled across the landscape, umbilically tied to its vast, creaking supply train. In its place, he created a distributed network. He divided his force into self-contained corps, each 20,000 to 30,000 strong. A corps was not merely a division of men. It was a complete, independent combined arms force. It contained its own infantry divisions, cavalry screens, artillery batteries, engineers, and staff. It was a living, breathing, fighting organism capable of sustained, independent action for days. It was an army in miniature, and Napoleon had a dozen of them. And then he unleashed them. He did not send an army down a road. He saturated a country. His corps marched not in a column, but on a broad front, advancing along multiple parallel routes separated by dozens of miles. The effect was transformative, terrifying. This was strategic dispersion with the promise of instantaneous concentration. To his enemies, it was a form of warfare cloaked in fog. They could not find a single, concentrated army to confront. Instead, they faced phantoms, reports of contact here, a cavalry screen there, a column sighted elsewhere. Their own forces were paralyzed, pinned to defensive positions, riddled with uncertainty, afraid to commit lest they be isolated and devoured by a force that seemed to materialize from the very ether. Then, with a coordination that felt supernatural, the drumbeat of scattered marching would synchronize into a single, deafening crescendo. This was Napoleon's art, the art of the convergent blow. Divisions flowing down separate river valleys would suddenly unite on the chosen battlefield, not as a tired, strung-out line of march, but as a clenched, focused fist. He mastered the strategy of the central position. He would interpose his united army between two separated enemy forces, hold one at bay with a minimal screen, and hurl his full mass against the other to crush it in detail. Then he would pivot, his army still humming with the momentum of victory, and annihilate the second, now isolated foe. It was warfare as a swift, surgical dissection of an opponent's coherence. His objective was no longer the limited, diplomatic victory of the old regime, to win a town, to force a negotiation. Napoleon's goal was absolute, total, and terrifyingly simple: the annihilation of the enemy's armed force in the field. La bataille d'engantissement, the battle of obliteration. He sought not to outmaneuver his opponent, but to erase his military capacity from existence. The battlefield was no longer a site of measured contest. It was a calculated abattoir. Fighting it all, he revolutionized artillery support. He massed cannon into grand batteries of 80 or 100 guns, using them not as accompaniments, but as the primary tool to blast holes in the enemy's soul and formation, to soften the target for the final, crushing impact. The result was a terrifying new tempo of war. Campaigns that once consumed entire seasons were decided in lightning strikes of weeks. The slow, stately minuet of the 18th century generals was replaced by a violent, orchestral crescendo. Jena, Austerlitz. Wagram, these were not mere battles. They were symphonies of applied force, masterclasses in the physics of mass, velocity, and shock. Yet, herein lay the horrific, tragic paradox at the heart of Napoleon's system. He commanded with the synoptic vision and digital speed of a new age, yet his soldiers still fought and died with the analog tools of the old. The decisive infantry weapon remained the smoothbore musket, inaccurate beyond a stone's throw. The very massed columns and dense lines, he used to concentrate his national will. Those magnificent instruments of his operational art became perfect, target-rich environments for the enemy's own concentrated volleys and artillery. The system designed for the efficient annihilation of the enemy became, with grim irony, a horrifically efficient producer of its own casualties. At Borodino, at Waterloo, the battlefield was transformed into a raw, industrial-scale harvest of human life. His engine consumed its own fuel at a staggering, unsustainable rate. He had perfected the grand formula: national will, multiplied by organizational speed, and focused into an annihilating mass, he had built the most formidable, dynamic military engine the world had yet witnessed. But the engine was voracious, and it was built around a core contradiction. It could deliver force with revolutionary speed, but it could not kill with equivalent efficiency. It had solved the puzzle of movement and concentration, but the final, logical piece, a weapon whose lethality matched the annihilating ambition of the system itself, was absent. The Napoleonic machine was running at a pace its own technology could not support. It was a masterpiece straining against its own limitations, waiting, desperately, for the material world to catch up to its conceptual brilliance. The next pivot would provide that terrible, missing piece, and in doing so, would render Napoleon's beautiful, brutal engine a relic of a more intimate, though no less bloody age. The system reached its conceptual zenith, a symphony of motion and mass conducted by a single, ruthless will. But at the core of its brilliance lay a fatal, physical contradiction. Its ambition was infinite, yet its fundamental tools remained stubbornly finite. It could deliver the concentrated fury of a nation to a precise point on the map with breathtaking speed. But once that fury was unpacked on the field, it could only kill with the crude, stochastic mechanics of the previous century. The Napoleonic engine was a quantum leap in strategic thought, bolted onto Neolithic killing technology. It screamed for a new physics of violence, not a better way to move men, but a fundamentally more efficient way to erase them. This is the fifth great pivot, the pivot to precision. The moment the bullet ceased to be a wild, scattered particle and became a thinking, linear extension of the soldier's will. The era when the chaotic democracy of the volley was overthrown by the autocracy of the aimed shot. For over 2 centuries, the infantryman's lethal authority had been a product of aggregation. The smoothbore musket, a glorified scattergun, mandated the line, the synchronized volley, the statistical cloud of lead. Its effective range was a social distance, the length of a city square, the reach of a human voice. War was waged in the sensory fog of black powder and communal terror. Killing was a collective, anonymous transaction, a matter of probabilities applied to a block of enemy uniforms. The relentless logic of the Industrial Revolution intervened, changing not the sociology of the army, but the very physics of its purpose. It began not with an explosion, but with a subtle, elegant manipulation of force, the spiral grooves of a rifled barrel imparting a gyroscopic spin. The rifle itself was an aristocrat's tool, a hunter's precision instrument, hamstrung by its laborious loading process. Then came the deceptively simple genius of Captain Minier, a conical, soft-lead bullet with a hollowed base. When fired, the expanding gases would flare this skirt outward, gripping the rifling snugly. This unassuming piece of shaped metal was the Rosetta Stone. It married the rifle's inherent accuracy with a rate of fire that matched, and soon surpassed, the old musket. The effect was not incremental, it was topological. It warped the very space of the battlefield. The lethal envelope of the common infantryman detonated from a radius of 100 paces to a sweeping dominion of 500 yards. The killing zone, once a cramped, smoky, intimate brawl, now stretched into a vast, silent, and terrifying plain. The magnificent, colorful, and dense formations that were the fingerprints of European warfare, the serried ranks of the line, the deep, earth-shaking columns of the attack, were instantly transmuted from instruments of domination into catastrophic liabilities. They were not just vulnerable, they were obscene invitations to massacre. This new, unforgiving reality was etched into the earth and the flesh of a fracturing new world. The American Civil War became the first, horrific clinical trial for the rifle's remorseless logic. The theory found its brutal, final proof on a Pennsylvania ridge in July of 1863. There, under orders, over 12,000 Confederate soldiers in Pickett's division performed the last, grand ballet of the Napoleonic charge. They did not advance into musket range. They embarked on a slow, doomed pilgrimage through a mile-long gauntlet of reasoned fire. Union defenders, armed with rifled muskets, many of them citizen soldiers no more professional than their foes, began dismantling the attack from the moment it stepped off. Officers fell first, then file closers, then the colors. The beautiful collective momentum of the massed column dissolved into a stumbling, bleeding mob long before it reached the Union line. The grand, decisive charge, the ultimate expression of concentrated human will, was exposed as a beautiful, archaic suicide note. The rifle had anointed the defender with the power of a sniper god and condemned the attacker to the role of ritual sacrifice. The instinctive mammalian response to this new, invisible hailstorm was not to stand taller, but to become smaller, to vanish into the ground. The soldier's most vital tool ceased to be his bayonet and became his entrenching spade. The rifle pit evolved, deepened, and multiplied into the continuous trench line. Warfare, in its forward offensive impulse, began to seize up, to congeal into a stagnant, parallel universe of mud and wire. The pivot to precision had bestowed such overwhelming advantage to the defense that it threatened to bring the very engine of offensive warfare, the engine Napoleon had perfected, to a permanent, grinding halt. The old, victorious equation of mass times momentum had been irrevocably broken on the anvil of ballistics. It was replaced by a colder, more static, and terrifyingly efficient formula, precision multiplied by cover. The value of the individual aimed shot skyrocketed, empowering the solitary soldier as never before. The space between contending armies was transfigured into a lethal, sterile desert, a no-man's land watched over by 1,000 patient, unseen, and reasoning eyes peering from behind berms of raw earth. The magnificent machine of annihilation now faced an existential crisis. It could deliver an army to the edge of the battlefield faster than ever imagined. But upon arrival, it found the battlefield itself had disappeared, swallowed by the earth, guarded by an invisible, precise, and democratically distributed death. The system had finally received its missing piece, a tool of exquisite, individualized lethality. But in solving the ancient problem of how to kill reliably at distance, it had birthed a monstrous new paradox. How do you close with and destroy an enemy you cannot see, who can extinguish your life from the length of 4 football fields? The rifle had answered the question of killing. It had created a far more profound problem, the problem of survival on the attack. The next pivot would be the frantic, industrial attempt to solve this, not by making men safer or more precise, but by making the storm of metal so absolute, so continuous, and so mindlessly dense that not even a trench, not even the earth itself, could provide sanctuary. It was the pivot from the reasoned, parsimonious shot of the thinking soldier to the hysterical, automatic, and indiscriminate downpour of the machine. The rifle had imposed a terrible, static logic upon the battlefield. Precision had created a defensive dominance so absolute it threatened to paralyze warfare itself, freezing the magnificent engine of movement into the mud of a permanent stalemate. The equation was simple and grim. The man in the trench with the rifle held dominion over the man in the open. The question that now consumed the tacticians and inventors of the late 19th century was not how to outrun this new, precise fire, for that was impossible, nor how to survive it in the open, for that was suicide. The only remaining solution was to drown it out, to replace the reasoned, parsimonious aimed shot with a continuous, mindless torrent, to replace the judgment of the soldier with the inhuman, rhythmic certainty of the mechanism, to evolve from the sharpshooter to the fire hose. This is the 6th great pivot, the pivot to automation. The moment the human agent was removed from the trigger pull, and lethal force became a self-sustaining industrial process. The age of the machine gun, the era where the battlefield itself began to manufacture death. The quest was for the hailstorm effect, to replicate, and then infinitely exceed, the statistical kill zone of the old musket volley. Early solutions were ingenious exercises in mechanical multiplication. The French mitrailleuse, a poised and deadly bouquet of rifle barrels fired in sequence. The American Gatling gun, a hand-cranked marvel of rotating chambers that turned a soldier into a one-man firing squad. These were tools of aggregation. But the true revolution, the one that severed the final sacred link between a man's intention and a bullet's flight, was one of pure automation. It was consummated in 1884 in a small London workshop, where the American inventor Hiram Maxim harnessed a force every shooter had cursed, recoiled. His Maxim gun was a brutal masterpiece of feedback. The violent, backward kick of each fired round was captured, channeled, and used to perform the entire cycle of death. Eject the spent brass, chamber a fresh cartridge, and recock the weapon. A human operator did not fire it, he supervised it. He fed the endless canvas belt and maintained the pressure on the trigger, becoming a mere attendant to an autonomous, hungry engine. The machine gun did not fire bullets. It extruded a solid, whining blade of lead. Its language was not the punctuated, democratic crack-crack-crack of riflemen, but a sustained, ripping, industrial RRRRRRIP. The sound of a giant zipper opening a seam in the world, a metallic tearing of the air itself. It transformed the tactical concept of beaten zone into a physical law of existence. A single weapon, sighted in a concealed fold of earth, could methodically shear a wheat field, a charging line, a river crossing clean of organic life. It could deny a bridge, a road, a valley not by threat, but by immutable geometric fact. It rendered the frontal assault, the last sacred dogma of the offensive spirit, the culmination of Napoleon's concentrated will, not merely costly or difficult, but a transgression against physics. It made heroism statistically obsolete. The final, chilling, and pedagogically stark proof of this new axiom was delivered not on the complex terrain of Europe, but on the open, theatrical plain of the Sudan at the Battle of Omdurman in 1898. There, a compact British-Egyptian force, a masterpiece of late Victorian industrial militarism equipped with battery after battery of Maxim guns and rapid-firing magazine rifles, squared itself against the army of the Mahdi, a force of breathtaking, pre-industrial courage, a living museum of warrior culture. The modest Ansar charged, as armies from Alexander to Napoleon had charged in dense, passionate waves, a tsunami of humanity propelled by faith. They were met not by a line of men, but by a silent, waiting wall of polished steel and blue water jackets. At a command, the Maxims spoke their one terrible word. The charge did not halt, it dissolved. It transformed from a coherent mass into a chaotic spray of falling bodies, like wheat before a scythe that moved at the speed of sound. By day's end, over 10,000 Mahdists lay dead or dying on the sun-bleached sand. British and Egyptian casualties were reported at fewer than 50. This was not a battle in any historical or moral sense. It was a laboratory demonstration, a clinical exhibition of the new, absolute, asymmetrical truth. Automated firepower divided by human courage equals annihilation. It was a sight that would haunt and instruct a generation of European officers who witnessed it or read its reports. This was the future of conflict between the automated and the merely brave. The psychological rupture was as profound as the physical carnage. The machine gun introduced a new taxonomy of terror, the horror of the impersonal, the dread of the mechanistic. A soldier could psychologically engage with an enemy who aimed at him. It was a grim form of respect, a deadly duel. But how does the human psyche contend with a weapon that dispenses death in a generalized, sweeping arc, that kills without sight, without malice, without even a human finger applying pressure at the precise instant of death? It was death as a natural disaster, a flash flood, a tornado, but one that could be summoned at will, boxed, transported, and set up on a tripod. It made the battlefield a place where machines hunted men. The pivot to automation solved the rifle's paradox of defensive dominance by refusing to play its game of aim and cover. It did not seek to beat precision with better precision. It sought to overwhelm the very idea of cover with sheer, volumetric hydraulic saturation. It answered the desperate question, how do you move against a fortified trench line? With the brutal, logical reply, you do not. You erase the trench and everyone in it from 1,000 yards away with a sideways rain of metal. But in its terrifying success, it created a deeper, strategic cancer. If the defense, now honeycombed with trenches and interlaced with invisible, chattering machine gun nests, was utterly impregnable to frontal infantry assault, then how were wars to be concluded? How could the great engine of national will, perfected by Napoleon, ever achieve its objective of decisive victory if it shattered its human components against this automated, steel-reinforced wall? The machine gun had not merely tilted the balance toward the defender. It threatened to break the fundamental dialectic of warfare, to make the offensive an act of futile, institutionalized suicide. The military system now possessed the ultimate, industrialized tool for killing, but that very tool had seemingly rendered decisive offensive action impossible. It had created a perfect, lethal stalemate. The final, culminating pivot would be the attempt to resolve this apocalyptic contradiction, not by inventing a new weapon, but by mobilizing an entire civilization, its factories, its railways, its science, and its very soul, to feed the insatiable, automated maw of the modern battlefield. It was the pivot from the machine on the battlefield to the battlefield as a machine, and the nation as its roaring, dedicated, totalizing factory. The machine gun had rendered its final mechanistic verdict, a pronouncement etched not in parchment, but in a continuous, shrieking river of fire and brass. It had resolved the primordial equation of killing with such faultless, automated finality that it birthed a profounder metaphysical paradox. It had annihilated the very possibility of conclusive triumph. The modern defense was no longer a line of men. It was a living geology, a steel-reinforced earthwork whose every fissure and parapet wept a horizontal, sweeping lead. Magnificent strategic engine, refined over centuries to focus the distilled will of a nation into a single, shattering blow, could now deliver its human essence to the precise coordinates of this new Hades with orchestral precision, only to observe that vital substance be systematically deconstructed, metabolized into a statistical report of casualties. Warfare had achieved a logical, seemingly absolute, terminus. The ancient dialogue of thrust and parry had reached a deafening, silent stalemate. If one humming maxim, nested in its chalky redoubt, could render an entire meadow atune, and a modern industrial leviathan could birth such instruments by the division, then what art, what stroke of mythic genius could possibly prevail? The answer, which emerged with the cold certainty of a proven law, was not to discover a cunning password to the Citadel's gate. The answer was to transmute into the Citadel, to mobilize not an army but the aggregate being of the nation, its mineral flesh, its collective psyche, its metabolic pulse, to wage war not as a contest of forces, but as the total operation of a civilization, a singular, distributed weapon of which the army was merely the cutting edge. This is the seventh and ultimate pivot, the pivot to totality. The moment war shed its last vestige of being a bounded event and metastasized into a perpetual, all-consuming state of being. The moment the cartographic notion of a battlefield evaporated, because every workshop bench, every railway switchyard, every classroom desk, and every private hope became an active sector in a conflict that recognized no frontier between home and hell. This pivot was the complete, apocalyptic wedding of the Industrial Revolution's material prowess to the French Revolution's ideological absolute. The brilliant, individual artifacts, the grooved barrel-granting spin, the recoil harness turning waste into work, the breech-loading steel cannon, stood exposed as mere lexicons in a grammar that demanded an entire language. They cried out for a system, an immense, interlocking, autocatalytic ecology of directed violence. The railroad matured into its central circulatory system, a branching lattice of iron veins and capillaries. It could translocate armies of millions, entire nomadic republics in uniform, from the agrarian interior to the hemorrhaging border in the span of a week, not a campaign season. More critically, it could sustain them with a perpetual, rhythmic, clockwork transfusion of shells by the continental trainload, of rations counted in thousands of tons, of boyish replacements arriving on a schedule to occupy the voids in the parapet left by the last precisely registered artillery stonk. The telegraph and nascent wireless became its synaptic nervous system, permitting a general staff ensconced in a remote, paneled headquarters to command armies deployed across a continent in the perpetual present, to synchronize the movements of these million-bodied organisms as if they were digits on a single, continent-spanning hand, reacting with a synaptic speed that would have vaporized the deliberative command of any prior age. Yet the true somatic bulk of this new Leviathan, its striated muscle and calcified bone, was the specialized factory, and its animating spirit was scientific mass production. War ceased to be assembled by guilds of armorers in royal foundries. It was fabricated in vast, dedicated industrial cathedrals whose sole sacrament was ruin. Chemical engineering complexes, monuments to applied science, synthesized high explosives, lyddite melanite TNT, on a stratigraphic scale, transmuting air, coal, and nitrates into localized doomsday. Nationalized steel mills, fed by captive mines, poured forth endless, glowing streams of shell casings, the endless tubes of field guns, the rolled plate of dreadnoughts. The entire political economy underwent a totalizing weaponization, retooled from the creation of civilian goods and agricultural tools to the relentless, standardized stamping of oblivion. This was no longer a nation in support of its army. This was a nation undergoing a terrifying ontological shift, its economic and biological essence directly metabolizing into its martial expression. And the people, the sovereign source of the revolutionary will, were no longer merely citizens who gave soldiers. They were a sovereign resource, a national inventory to be managed with the dispassionate, scientific rigor of an engineer optimizing a vast and terrible machine. Universal conscription harvested every viable male body in a continuous demographic harvest. Yet the mobilization penetrated far deeper. Propaganda ministries, a novel and essential organ of the modern state, colonized every mind, fermenting a potent, factory-processed nationalism through state-curated newspapers, iconic, emotionally engineered posters, and a standardized education system that taught chemistry as the science of explosives, geography as the study of strategic frontiers, and history as the prelude to an inevitable and righteous clash. Women were mobilized not as ancillary caregivers in the rear, but as essential industrial combatants in the munitions works. Their hands, once skilled in the subtle arts of home and hearth, now performing the delicate, deadly ballet of assembling percussion caps and fuses that would, in distant, sodden fields, sever the limbs and stop the hearts of other women's sons. The ancient, civilizational firewall between combatant and non-combatant, between the front and the hearth, first frayed, then melted, and finally dissolved in the crucible of shared, total endeavor. The home front was conceptually invented, a critical theater of production, sacrifice, and morale, its resilience and output as decisive to national survival as the holding of any muddy salient at Ypres or Verdun. The strategic objective emergent from this totality was no longer the Napoleonic dream of the decisive battle of annihilation. That was a fantasy rendered obsolete by firepower. The new objective was attrition, a dreadful, abstract calculus of endurance, a grim audit of national staying power. The aim was to harness the aggregate productive, demographic, and psychological mass of your entire civilization and apply it, like a slow, inexorable, continental-scale hydraulic press, against the integrated societal machine of the enemy. Victory would be awarded not to the most valiant, nor to the most operatically brilliant field marshal, but to the coalition whose industrialized, logistical, and social organism could simply persist the longest, could endure the most catastrophic, continuous hemorrhage of men and materiel, a veritable exsanguination of the national body, without suffering a fatal systemic collapse, a fracture in the collective will to continue. War had become a protracted, horrific examination of a society's total existential vitality, its technical ingenuity, its social cohesion, its economic resilience, and its ultimate spiritual stamina in the face of industrialized horror. By the twilight of the 19th century, the evolution stood irrevocably complete. The 7 pivots had compounded upon one another in a terrifying, logical progression, each solving the fatal flaw of its predecessor, only to disclose a new, more profound and vulnerable depth. From the imposed, robotic discipline of the line, to the mastered logistics of supply and siege, to the volcanic unleashing of the will of the people, to the engineered system of operational annihilation, to the precision of the rifled, reasoning bullet, to the automation of the chattering machine gun. And finally, irrevocably, to the totality of the industrial nation in arms. Every component was perfected, integrated, and held in a state of hair-trigger readiness. The great European powers now existed as fully realized, sovereign war entities, each a closed, hermetically sealed universe of latent, cataclysmic violence. They had, through 3 centuries of relentless, often ruthless experimentation, engineered the perfect, closed-loop formula for modern industrialized conflict. Absolute national will, processed through the infinite furnace of industrial capacity, delivered by the infallible clockwork of railroad logistics, and expressed as the annihilating, automated firepower of the machine gun and quick-firing artillery over a contested, immobilized landscape of entrenched defense. They had constructed a doomsday machine of such elegant, interconnected, and monstrous complexity that it could be activated by a political decision. But once set in motion, its operational logic was autonomous, a force of nature beyond human steering. It awaited only the spark. In the fateful, luminous summer of 1914, the spark was struck. And when it was, the machine performed its function with horrific, flawless fidelity. It mobilized millions according to precise, pre-written timetables. It hurled them against the frontiers in vast, wheeling maneuvers. It supplied them with pyramidal mountains of shells from its endlessly roaring forges. It entombed them in the reciprocal, sophisticated earthworks of stalemate. And then, with the serene, indifferent logic of a natural law, it began to consume them, feeding its own colossal, insatiable appetite with the very flesh, spirit, and future of the nations that had, with such peerless ingenuity and ambition, conceived and built it. The Great War that ensued was not a malfunction of design, a tragic accident of statecraft. It was the system's first and most horrifyingly successful full-scale operational test. The industrialized slaughter of the Western Front was not an aberration in the history of warfare. It was the consummation, the final, logical, and tragically inevitable output of the supreme equation derived across 300 years of relentless martial calculus. They had sought, with brilliant, unwavering dedication, to engineer certain victory. What they ultimately unleashed was a phenomenon for which their classical vocabulary held no adequate name, for they had just birthed it into the world. Total war. The war where the factory and the front are one, where the soldier and the citizen are fused, and where the only true enemy and the final, absolute casualty is the hope of the future itself.